Hey there. Hey there, everyone. My name is Chris Ostro. Look at this. That's me. I'm an assistant teaching professor for the program in writing and rhetoric, as well as the learning and AI strategist for the learning design group at CU. I have sort of a weird role in that I'm 50% professor, 50% course designer. And I really like it because both halves of my job inform the other and make me better at them. So here, I think it's really important to, we're going to be talking about AI integrity today. I really think it's important to talk about what types of classrooms I'm in because increasingly the research has made it clear that the type of classroom you're in matters a ton. So first and foremost, I teach both in person and asynchronous online. It's worth noting that the in person I teach is an in person hybrid. So it's an in person class that goes for an hour and a half, and then there is still some offline async work they do, but I still run it largely like an in person traditional classroom. Also, I teach a process rather than a product oriented course. And that might seem weird, but I think this verbiage is starting to develop now as it should, right? I have friends who are in the business school, faculty, and they just want students to be able to create a really good marketing plan. And they don't really care how that student creates that marketing plan. All that matters is the product. Whereas, I teach a writing class. I care about the process. If I only cared about the product, I would have a very different approach to this, though. I also teach in a major R1 school, right? CU Boulder is a huge school, huge costs, competitive students. And in these sorts of situations, it matters a lot because students, especially with costs this high and with consequences potentially this high, are really driven to pass, at all costs. And for some students, this means reaching out for additional help, scaffolding, and support. For other students, it might lead to some less than ideal decision making. But I think that's just worth highlighting. And then finally, I teach classes of 15 to 25 students. Again, if I was teaching a 400-person lecture, I think I'd have a really different approach. Finally, most of my classes, one of my classes is almost entirely freshman and sophomore. There's literally one senior who got stuck in it somehow. And then the other classes, all junior, seniors, or non-traditional students, right? I mean, the oldest student in that class is in his 40s, and the youngest student in that class, she is 21. So just worth kind of throwing that out there because I actually see these two classes bifurcated in how they react to my policy. And we'll talk about that later. So first, I want to set the scene, right? I think all of us, if you're in this chat, it's probably because you've had some issues, concerns with AI and its impact on integrity. So I want to just set the scene of the first time I encountered this, right? This was a summer intensive class, a 5-week upper level writing class teaching comics and graphic novels as art. Oh, I was excited. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. And also because it was the summer, I was actually on a family trip with my wife and her family, going to New Orleans. And there was a lunch where they all went out. And I was like, yeah, of course, let the mom and her 3 kids go out. I'll take this time to hang back, do a little grading. This way I can go out for dinner and stuff them later. So, of course, I'm on this family trip and the worst happens. First, I have this sheaf of papers, about 20 essays I'm about to grade. And I start noticing readings are being utilized really weirdly, right? So first, students are referencing stuff from way outside of our readings. It's not unheard of, but usually this is like a try-hard student thing to do, not a, everyone thing to do. Secondly, most papers are referencing 1 to 2 readings at most, which is weird because it actually doesn't even fill the assignment prompts. At least this specific paper was about comparing how 3 different writers wrote one character and what differences and, analyzing those decisions. Third, a lot of them were making references from mysterious readings might be a good way to put it. And I don't want to act too confident, like I know every reading that's ever been written on comics, but taught the class a number of times. I've seen a lot of things, and it was weird to just start seeing stuff I'd never heard of, and then I really couldn't track down. Beyond that, student papers were just missing basics. Most of them had the wrong number of sources. Almost all of them were the wrong length. A few of them were integrating content well. And also, I noticed a lot of students were just skipping scaffold assignments, right? They weren't doing annotated bibs. They weren't doing their rough drafts. They were not participating in peer reviews, but then they turned in a perfectly polished final draft. And then finally, a lot of the students were just making the same 2 to 3 references. This very quickly started putting off alarm bells for me. And I think if you're in this room, maybe you've had this experience. So what did I do? Proud to say, I panicked. Oh my God, are you serious? I'm on vacation and this is like, I'm trying to do this quickly at lunch. I was terrified. This ruined the whole day. First things I did, sent out a passive aggressive email banning all generative AI use. I thought it was all cheating because at this point I'd kind of figured out what had happened, right? I'm looking around online. I find that these tools exist. banned all AUs, thought it was all cheating. I think I was wrong. We'll come back to that later. I also personalized their decisions. Why would they do this to me? Why are they cheating on my assignment in my class? Or it's a comics class. Why aren't you having fun? Side note, if you're ever yelling at your students, why aren't you having fun? You're the reason they're not having fun. But also, the one right thing I did was I took all of my prompts and I started running them through ChatGPT just to see what kind of output it was spitting out. And this took a while, right? I wish I had done this when I was actually creating the course, but after I read maybe a dozen or so answers to the prompt, I started seeing the patterns that I could see in the student writings. And this was time consuming, but definitely worth that time. But then I also just started using, haphazard AI detection use. At that point, it was the Wild West. There were a dozen or so different, detectors that all claimed they were amazing. I started just using each of those and then using those as an excuse to reach out to students. Hey, Timmy, I noticed your paper got such and such score on the Zero GPT one and this other score on Turnitin's Roberta analyzer. And I basically started playing cops and robbers with all my students. This was, again, I think we could say less than ideal. And what I learned pretty quickly, I was actually able to get somewhat near certainty if I put in an insane amount of time, right? I ended up reporting over that semester and the next semester. I ended up filing 15 honor code reports. 14 of them ended up admitting to it. One of them didn't, but literally his paper was entirely full of hallucinations, so I feel pretty confident. And all 15 were supported by the honor code council. But it was unsustainable. Like the time-consuming nature of this literally was not tenable. That one sheaf of papers that I had estimated would be 3 to 4 hours of work took me over 20. And I do not have the time in my life, let alone in my work life, to do that. Also, it totally torched the student-teacher dynamic. My students weren't comfortable around me. They didn't trust me. They were terrified. I was just constantly trying to trick them, and I get it. It also, from my end, made teaching awful. And maybe that seems silly to put on the here, but I love teaching. I have taught in some way since 2011, and it is truly one of my favorite hobbies, let alone a job. Ugh. And the fact that I had made something I love so terrible was not ideal. Also, as I was playing around with ChatGPT to sort of try to get to the bottom of things, I really did pretty quickly realize there are ethical ways you can use this tool. There are definitely good things you can do with this. And, just like anything, some students are trying and some students are lying. I think this is a place where my role as a course designer and a faculty member really helped because most faculty members I know, I think, woefully overestimate the number of students who are trying to cheat. But I also think most administrators and course designers and staff that I know really underestimate that number. The fact is, there are a few in every class. But there are also now where a lot of students who just authentically were trying to learn. They wanted to know this new technology. And what I had done was really screw over those students because I was just so anxious about the cheaters. But I also can't just let the cheaters do whatever they want, right? I had to figure out a middle ground here. But it also became really clear to me towards the end of this that banning just was not going to work. And let's talk about why banning didn't work. First, there was already really high student buy-in, right? I mean, I have some citations for each of these here, but honestly, for all these points, there are 6 or 7 citations I considered. But, the DEC study already today finds, 85%. The Harvard one finds 92% student buy-in for AI. The question was like using AI weekly. That's pretty high. I would also even point out that in 2023, when I was panicking in New Orleans, there was a study Harvard did then that came up at about 52%. That's still half my students. But also, again, these tools have legitimate uses, right? Bestani et al., I think, is the single article that changed my view on AI the most. Bestani et al. Is an article where they're trying to teach students some coding, and they have an AI tutor bot and a just normal ChatGPT instance, and they let students kind of self-guide in that second group. And then they have a control group that is someone learning a traditional way. And what they found was students who use the AI bots actually were able to attain a certain level of mastery way more quickly. But without proper guidance, they were not able to retain that knowledge, right? And what that really quickly taught me is that these tools, if leveraged correctly, could be profoundly valuable. But if they're not leveraged correctly, there's a huge risk of it actually hurting the students. And that really changed my stance on this. And then finally, students want to understand it. The lowest I was able to find on any survey was 40% for students who think that the administration, like their university administration, should teach AI literacy, right? This is, I think most students have identified that we need knowledge on. So we have this weird thing where Students are already doing it a bunch. B, there's a safe and unsafe ways to do it. And C, I don't know if I said one or two, whatever. Three, students want guidance. And I had, instead of doing any of that, I had just totally said no. So what had I done? I'd accidentally created an abstinence only course, but for AI instead of sex or drugs, right? And just like with sex and drugs, I would argue abstinence only education for AI does not work. So I pivoted. By the way, here's some great images that AI helped me generate about AI abstinence only education. Just say no. But anyway, critical realization. So if there's already high student buy-in, that's a reality. I can't do anything about that. I do want to actually stop on this for a second and say, I think because of how much I embrace AI in my course design, a lot of faculty I work with think that I'm some sort of a weird tech disciple guru, someone who's just like really loves this stuff. I think it's interesting, but honestly, if I could press a button and undo everything that has been done with AI in the past 2 years, I probably would, but I can't. That's not the world we live in. I don't have those sort of Thanos powers. Secondly, there is ethical use of these tools, but it's complicated. So I need to help them draw clear lines, and I need to help them figure out where those lines are. And then finally, students want to understand it, then I need to be the one who's providing them training, right? Kind of taking, again, this more harm reduction approach. So as I pivoted, I tried to set up some really clear goals. First, and again, it's really cynical for me to put this up top, but it's a reality of teaching. I have to bring my time investment down. I can't possibly be putting 80 hours a week into one class. That's just not doable. Secondly, I need to familiarize myself with the tools that exist. My students most of them were using ChatGPT, but it became really clear there's a bunch of other cool stuff out there. So that was a journey I had to go on. Third, I had to get to the same side as my students, right? This is so silly sounding, but again, I hated how my classroom felt. And I wanted it to be clear that I was an ally and on their side, and I'm, mentoring and whatever, not the big, scary, authoritarian figure coming down on them. Fourth, I needed to be willing to use the honor code as a last resort, but it truly should be a last resort. But again, because there are some students who are always trying to push the lines and get away with what they can, I need to make it clear there is actually a point where consequences hit. Then after that, I need to figure out AI detection, right? I can't possibly believe that there's all these different tools that all claim to be nearly 100% accurate, but also they give me different scores when I put in a paper. That doesn't make any sense. Then finally, I needed to encourage and teach some ethical use, draw those lines with my students, help them figure out where those are. And I needed to really discourage lazy use. And when I say lazy use, just to throw a definition of this, all I mean is passing on unedited AI output as your own. To me, it was very clear that that was a fail state, that if my students were doing that, I had first of all, they were definitely screwing up, but I had screwed up something about explanations. And again, I need to clarify those lines. So where I'm at now is I've kind of developed this Mosaic approach, and we'll talk about why I call it that in a bit. But ultimately, it became clear to me there are a few really good but imperfect ways to do this. And each of them isn't perfect, but if I sort of line them up over each other, I can start to kind of make something. So first, AI literacy assignments. I think this is the single most important thing, right? My students want to know about AI. Let me teach them. So first, I really wanted to teach students how to efficiently use these tools, but also how to build that skepticism, right? Because ultimately, I think that's the future of these tools, right? People are going to use these things to help cut corners and automate certain parts of tasks they don't like doing. But if they don't have these critical thinking skills that they need, they're never really going to create output better than what ChatGPT gives them in the first place. So I need to build that. And one of the things I always told them, I have a few students who would push back on this. And what I would try to really get across them is that if you uncritically pass on AI output as your own, all you've done is automate your future jobs. And for even the most cynical students that I've worked with, this has been a pretty winning argument, because I think they see that they need to learn how to use this stuff better than this stuff on its own. Otherwise, why would they ever get paid for using it? Any company can afford a $20 a month ChatGPT subscription. Secondly, students need guidance, right? It was really clear to me there was a huge gap. Some students had years of playing with these tools. Some students had days. And anything I could do to help bridge that gap and give guidance to both sides was really helpful. Third, this was hard because there's a lack of subject knowledge mastery. The first thing I ever did with ChatGPT, and this says so much about me, I guess one of the first things in my own curiosity explorations, was I asked it to write some Latin eulogies for me. I used to teach Latin classics. Don't say I never claimed I wasn't pretentious, all right? But I had it write these Latin eulogies. And as soon as I looked at it, it struck me as wrong. And the reason was because each sentence was like beautifully impeccable Latin, but each sentence was a different century style of Latin. There is no Roman who ever would have written like this because it literally spanned about 1,200 years of style. Past that, the content of it was crazy. It was all like, I'm sure dad is in heaven looking down on us, proud of his grandkids. It's like, that's not really how the Romans thought about this stuff. But I only knew that because I have that subject mastery. My students don't yet. The whole point of them being in college is to attain that subject mastery. They don't have it yet. So what I found was actually really successful was finding the one thing they have some level of knowledge of, like great knowledge of, which is themselves. So I started developing assignments that force them to work with ChatGPT in reflexive ways. So the first one here is this Odyssey project example. I mean, feel free to go click through these on your own. There's only one thing I'm going to pull up, but this Odyssey project example, I see Brad throw it in the chat, is one where they basically have written a bunch about their interests, their passions, and then they have come up with their own 5-year plan for their life. And then they ask ChatGPT, based on some of their writings, what does it think they'd be good at? And I have them reflect on how these things don't line up perfectly. And they don't, they never line up perfectly. And it immediately makes my students skeptical. The second one here, that profile journal post, that to me is actually the much more effective assignment. This is one where at this point, students have used ChatGPT for, I don't know, anywhere from 7 to 10 assignments at this point. And then they go ask ChatGPT to write a 2-page profile of them. And it will do a pretty okay job, but it's also like looking at a carnival mirror of yourself. If you haven't, I encourage you to do this yourself because it will really exaggerate certain things and really undersell other things. You know, I think Brad and a few others have heard this story, but this is another place where my own ChatGPT usage made me laugh hysterically. The first time I did this, it was convinced that I loved weed humor. I have no idea why. And eventually I figured out it's because one time, a full year earlier, I had asked it to help me come up with a weed joke for a fantasy football related reason. But that's the point. These tools kind of hold on to this data in weird ways, and they absolutely can expand or contract and make weird extrapolations. And this was a great way to teach my students that. And then I think one of the big limitations of AI literacy assignments, though, is that you as faculty can only teach what you know. And there's really no workaround for that. I can't give you a great mastery of AI, sadly, but I can at least help you like maybe figure out some tools to start with. Feel free to drop me a line. I'm glad to like maybe help you in that journey. But this is the time right now, after this talk, or after the last talk you attend today, don't skip the next talk, where you should go actually start playing with these things. Because if you can get a handle on it, you can suddenly start winning some students back. But then beyond that, I developed an AI disclosure form. It was really clear to me in conversations with students that the number one concern was that they'd be honor coded or that this would in some way become a conduct violation. So I needed to bypass that. And what I found was actually coming up with this form, and we'll take a look at it in a second, but I basically came up with a form that if students fill it out when they turn in a paper and they're honest, the deal I make is that you will never be honor coded for this. I might ask you to rewrite some parts, right? If I think you went way too hard on a tool, I might ask you to, go rewrite that one portion. Let's meet up and talk about ways to do this better. But I will never assume you are acting in bad faith. This has been huge for my students. Suddenly, my students are very honestly talking to me about a lot of this stuff, most of them. It also clarified and modeled transparency for my students. I have been clarifying to them that transparency was important. And as we'll see, I model it in other ways, but this is one way where I'm really encouraging that. And I will say, it wasn't perfect at first, but iteration really can help, right? My first attempt at this was absolute nightmare because all it was, feel free to take a look at it, was just a quick, hey, just tell me what you're doing. And that's good. Just put a paragraph at the end. Here, let me share that. Bam. Right. So this was the original one where I just had students write a paragraph at the end about their AI use. And this was totally worthless. Right. Some students remembered, some didn't. They all put it in different formats. But also, a lot of students didn't know what qualified as an AI tool. Tons of students were shocked that I counted Grammarly as AI. Right. So looking at my updated one post iteration. Hey, here's the CU honor code statement. If you fill this out honestly, you are at no risk of being honor coded. This is my deal to the students, right? This is my way of getting them to trust me and come on board. And then it's just a quick checkbox, or honestly, most students just highlight it, right? Tell me which of these tools you used. Great. And then tell me for what purposes. Great. And then, hey, at the end, give me, if you use ChatGPT, share the link to your ChatGPT chat with me. And also, if you use Google Docs or Office 365, share that link too. And we'll talk about why in a second, but hopefully, that makes sense. This was supposed to be quick and unobtrusive. By the way, visual's still working. I didn't screw that up, right? We're all good? I'm going to take that as a yes. So again, this should be quick and unobtrusive. If I'm giving my students a whole additional assignment because they used AI, they're just going to lie. And I see this all the time. One faculty member that I'm aware of at CU does a thing where they make students submit a new draft of save a new draft every 15 minutes. So at the end, they get a packet of 18, Word files. That's insane. And I think no student really is ever going to have to do that again in their work life. And I think it's an unfair ask of the student. So it was important to me to find something easy. That being said, this isn't perfect, right? First of all, students can forget. And my solution to that was to put it everywhere. If you jumped into my Canvas course right now, you would see this form on its own page. You would see this form on the syllabus and reminders about this form. Every single prompt has this form at the end. And then finally, on that page, the actual page on AI literacy is a 15-minute video explainer where I'm just kind of explaining the logic behind it, right? I wanted to make it so students couldn't possibly act like they didn't know it was a thing. But, if students are already acting in bad faith, which again, there always are one or two, it happens, they could just lie here. So that kind of left me in a weird place where I had to solve that problem. So that led me to AI detection. And I'll just say up front, I take a stance on AI detection that I know some people get really flustered by. I think these tools are imperfect, but still usable, right? Pangram claims 98 to 99, somewhere in their accuracy. Turnitin, 97.5 to 99, somewhere in there. GPT-0 kind of claims in that same ballpark, 95-ish. There are all these different tools that exist, and they are all different types of reliable. None of them is 100%, but I think that's still okay. I would point out that pre-AI, Turnitin itself wasn't 100% perfect for plagiarism. We just learned how to use it. Sometimes it would highlight something and you're like, oh, that's just highlighting a quote for some reason, right? I think these tools, we should not make the same mistake that our students sometimes make. We should be critical of these tools when using them, just like AI. But I think they're still usable. And if you're not sure, here's actually a talk that I gave about this recently, kind of doing a literature review on what all the literature says on this, and also a podcast if that's more your thing. But I really do encourage both. They're pretty good listens, I think. I don't know, maybe that's a little cocky. But if nothing else, I think all of the research agrees it is more reliable than our eyes. By far, the most reliable human detector that has ever been found was someone who actually worked as a text classifier, one of those awful jobs where you're literally just reading text and classifying it one way or the other professionally, right? And that person had 92% accuracy. For most professors, and this might frustrate a bunch of you, but I do talk about this in one of those talks, actually the average human was worse than guessing, right? The average human professor, they actually looked at linguistics professors specifically, were under 40% accurate. So that's a huge problem. If nothing else, I needed something that was more reliable than my peepers. Also, though, this gave me a great chance to model transparency. Let me just tell my students, I'm doing this. Here is a link to these tools that you can go use. Go ahead and write your paper, and if you're feeling anxiety, run it through there. And if it gives you a weird score, reach out to me and we'll talk about it. I do have students who do that, and it's really helpful. It allows us to bridge that gap. We're not playing cops and robbers. We're playing collaborators at that point. We're trying to figure it out together. Also, it focuses my vision and saves me time, right? At the end of the day, one thing that I do believe is that if I run a paper through Pangram and Turnitin and GPT-0 and it gets a 0% on all three, I'm good. Maybe that they probably wrote that. And that just saves me a ton of time. Even, by the way, if they didn't write it and they somehow tricked all three of those, that on its own is its own incredible feat that deserves some weird reward. But one of the people I talked to had a really great metaphor of using AI detection like a metal detector, right? Imagine you're going along a beach and you're just like beep, 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 beep. Sometimes you're not going to find anything, right? Sometimes it's going to beep, you dig, and it's just a can. But sometimes it's going to be a gold ring. But no matter what, that is always way more efficient than just trying to dig the whole beach. It's about helping you figure out where you prioritize your energy. And then also the other thing I've learned about these tools is using them longitudinally over a course is huge, right? As I am looking at one student's work, if I put it through 3 or 4 different things, if I have 3 or 4 different papers that student wrote and I put it through these tools and it keeps showing up as AI, that tells me there's definitely something they're doing. They might not even know they're doing it actually, but still, this is almost always one of my starting points for conversations with students. And we'll talk about that in a second. Also, the one real concern that I want to throw out here, I saw a question in the chat about intellectual property. We can talk about that in a few. But another one I want to touch on is FERPA compliance. It is really, really clear that some of these tools, we don't know how they handle student data. So I never put through anything that has student identifying information. If I'm uploading a paper into these, I'm stripping the student's name, the student's ID, authorship, all that, right? It is just the text of what they actually wrote. And that is a little more time consuming, but I'd rather be mindful of FERPA compliance and stuff when doing that. Going forward, this led me to process tracking. Things like Google Docs, Office 365, these keep detailed version histories. That can be really useful. Oftentimes, if I look at someone's version history, that can tell me the story of how that paper was composed. But it is also spoofable. Tools have existed even pre-AI that allowed you to edit those revision histories. And now those tools are absolutely in vogue. I will say, if there's evidence of a student using one of those tools, there is no innocent explanation. That is a tool that exists only for academic misconduct. But there are actually tons of legitimate reasons that a student's version history might look funky, right? I had a student who was on a flight. They were writing their paper on the flight. They lost Wi-Fi. When they landed, it reconnected, and suddenly, huge block of text appeared. That student didn't cheat. They just flew. And if I had just looked at that and made an assumption, I probably would have been wrong. So again, this is a good but not perfect solution. Also, as a small side, I'm going to plug playback apps. There are tons of Chrome extensions you can get that actually, you can go on a Google Doc and hit play. It'll actually show you the paper being written as a movie. These are usually really helpful for catching suspicious things. But again, a good, not perfect solution. All of these things lead to that next phase of awkward conversations. If from those 4 first steps, I have questions about a student's paper, I should reach out to them. So I will say, first and foremost, if you are ever someone who might honor code a student, you should always talk to that student beforehand. There are so many legitimate reasons they might trip AI detection, they might have a weird revision history, or any of this other stuff. Beyond that, though, most students, in my experience, are not super experienced, grizzled liars. I mean this seriously. I have had one student who I honestly honor coded who I suspect lied to me in every interaction about this. Almost all of them, the moment that I reached out, I was like, yeah, I noticed something kind of weird here. On your AI disclosure form, you said you only use Gemini in this way, but actually in these 2 paragraphs, it kind of looks like you generated them. Almost every student at that point is like, oh yeah, I did. I didn't know if that counted, or I didn't know how to put that in there, And it's pretty useful, right? Suddenly we're back on the same side and we're trying to figure out, okay, how can you kind of be a bit more transparent next time? Modeling transparency as practice. And again, if met with understanding, most students are going to be honest. At this point, their number one concern is just getting in trouble. And if you make it clear that I'm not trying to get you in trouble, a lot of them are going to be really willing to work with you and be transparent. And again, if nothing else, this models engagement and instructor presence, which I think are hugely important, especially in asynchronous courses. Anything I can do to make my students see me as a real human being and not just a guy, a grading robot on the other side of the world is huge. And again, hey, students can lie, so this is a good but not perfect solution. Which leads me finally to this last phase, second chances. As a rule of thumb, I'm almost never going to honor code a student based on one assignment for a few reasons, right? Because there's sort of this weird flowchart that can come out of this. First, if I meet with a student and they were totally honest, yeah, I use it this way, I didn't report it, I honestly didn't think you'd catch it, then great. I have helped them find the line and we can kind of go forward. Definitely now I know they know where that line is. Anything past this that kind of does that same thing is definitely academic misconduct. But secondly, let's say I meet with a student and they lied. At the very least, even if I don't catch them in that moment, they know they've been caught. And if they're strategic about this, it will force them to kind of pull back a little and try to toe the line on their own. Third, if a student lied and continues to cross that line and get caught, I now have a track record of stuff I can send to the honor code office. I'm not basing it on one data point. I'm basing it on a pattern of behavior. And this allows you to act with just so much more certainty, encouraging students exploring this new tool, often clumsily. I think it's important to remember part of being a student is being clumsy. right? You're figuring stuff out. You're not experts. And this allows me to encourage those students who are exploring, as long as they're upfront with me, while also holding some other students really accountable. So many solutions that tell part of the story. Where does that leave me? A mosaic approach. Look at that. ChatGPT, thank you for that image as well. I also want to throw out here, by the way, I'm aware of people like Jason Goulia and stuff using the phrase Swiss cheese approach. I have absolutely, I wanted to use that. And then when I started Googling it, I realized it's used for other things as well. I'd already been calling it the mosaic approach. And like I said, I'm a pretentious classicist, right? I'm just going to stick with what I know. This is part of my DNA. So where I'm at now, I've been doing this approach for about a year, and I want to talk about my pros and cons. Pros, the vast majority of my students are self-reporting. I'd say 80% in my asynchronous upper level course and about 50% in my first year in-person course. Also, more students are corrected and fewer honor codes, right? I would say the most common thing is I see that a student might have done something over the line. I email them, they show up at the meeting, we talk it out, I clarify the line, and then they're good. I'm helping them actually work with me rather than try to get away from me. Also, less time investment. I am not spending 20 hours per packet of papers anymore, thankfully. Finally, I'm back to teaching the writing process. Honestly, a lot of my feedback that I'm giving to students now, especially if they fill out that AI disclosure form, will often involve how they use those tools. Hey, I noticed here you mentioned that you did this prompt. I went and looked at your ChatGPT chat. I think part of the problem is that your prompt wasn't restrictive enough here, and it leads to these issues. Let's talk about ways you can prompt this better and ways you can pull some of this in. And then this has really went a long way to repairing the student-teacher relationship. Look, all I can do here is give some anecdata because I don't know, this is just how I'm doing my classes. But in my courses, I have had in my upper level course at this point, multiple students come to office hours and thank me for this policy, which I think is weird, but it's worked, right? I have won some students over and they now feel safe playing with AI, and that's great. And then finally, teaching is fun again. I love nothing more than when at my office hours, 2 or 3 students show up and we spend half the time just screwing around with AI, right? We look at what they did in their paper, saw what worked, what didn't, and then pivot to just like playing around with ChatGPT and talking about weird conversations we had recently. I'm teaching again, and it's fun. It's not perfect though, right? I got some cons. First, I still have some uncertainty, right? Anytime a paper comes in that, Pangram gives one score and GPT-0 gives another score, I am left in this weird place of not totally knowing, but at least I kind of have some next steps. Beyond that, this still takes some substantial time. It's nowhere near as bad as it was in 2023, but it's also not, I'm not putting as little time into my grading as I was pre-pandemic. I'm also not convinced how scalable this is, if I'm honest. I think this works really well for me for a few different reasons, but I think if you were teaching a ton of asynchronous courses, or if you were teaching things that are more product oriented, that would be difficult. And also, if you were someone who's maybe less confident with these tools or less experienced, that could be an issue too. And I'm seeing this to some degree, right? I'm recently supporting a faculty member who is teaching a master's level leadership course that, we saw 40% of their work that students are submitting is unedited AI. And that is a whole thing that we're trying to figure out right now. It is clear that different class types will have different sort of avenues that might work or not work better or worse. Also, one downside of this is I have to kind of constantly keep up with what's happening in the tech, right? The moment that a tool comes out that I don't become familiar with, I think that's a real issue for me. And then this is just my own curiosity. I'm not sure why my 2 classes have went so differently. Honestly, if you had asked me earlier, I would have really assumed that my in-person class would be easier and that most of my students would have more buy-in there. But it's actually been the opposite. My asynchronous class has been the one where my students have reacted the most positively. And I think a big part of that is about student experience. Again, those students are 21 years or older. I think for them, also being closer to the workplace, having a class where they now know they can safely talk about this stuff, I think is important. Beyond that, I'm not really sure why else, but that's something I really need to explore. So in terms of what's next, dying over here. In terms of what next, I need to continue development of some of my AI literacy assignments, especially in that first year class. I think that's something I could keep polishing for sure, right? I've got a few really good ideas, but I still have a lot of things I need to keep developing and implementing. Beyond that, though, these students have real skill deficits left over from the pandemic, and that itself is kind of causing me to bend and curve some of these issues, right? I also suspect, 5 years from now, students might have less or at least different skill deficit issues. I also need more in-class modeling. Right now, I do some stuff where we talk about using ChatGPT for research, using ChatGPT for, just chatting and brainstorming. But it probably would be better if for me to pull in other uses in the classroom and model them. And then finally, again, I need to look into some research actually differentiating the course type and see if I can figure out more about that upper level, lower level division I'm seeing. But that's where I'm at. So where are you all at? Give me some questions. I'm probably going to stop the screen share now because I want to see some faces and hear some thoughts.
Yeah. And if people want, we could stop the recording if you have sensitive questions, but there were a couple in chat that seemed pretty great. Chris, you might have gotten to the first one on intellectual property. Was there anything to add to that? How do you navigate the intellectual property privacy issues on your students' work with these tools? I think you hit on that, but I just wanted to revisit.
Yeah, I talked about it more from the FERPA angle. My experience has been, and I've talked with my students about this, right? I do have in that syllabus language, if you're uncomfortable with this for IP reasons, please reach out to me and let me know. I have to date had 0 students ever bring that up to me. And in fact, when I brought it up in a class lecture, multiple students laughed. Like I'm not saying this isn't an issue that we should care about. It is, but I think it is an issue that we care about more than a lot of students. Not to say that students know what's best. I would be woeful to say that as well. But I do think that, again, I'm going on my way to strip student identifying information. I'm giving them multiple opportunities. I'm making them aware I'm going to be doing this with their property, their IP, and I'm also giving them access and like giving them the ability to tell me no. All that being said, though, there's a bunch of things like Turnitin that we already automatically run papers through on Canvas that, we don't really ask for student consent on. So I don't go anything further than that. But again, I'm copy pasting in the parts that don't have any identifying information for FERPA at least.
Thanks for reassuring that and just talking about, wiping out that FERPA information, HIPAA information before doing things. Michelle had a great question. You mentioned Google Dropback in passing. You said it kind of quick about turning Word or documents into, or Google Docs in that case, into little videos so you can watch. There was a question, is there something in Office 365? I wasn't
Ooh.
sure what you used.
I am sure there. So again, I have only had, ever since we made the switch to Microsoft, I've had very few students submit Office 365 docs. They still all greatly prefer Google because Google has cornered the market on K through 12, right? I have multiple students who tell me they've literally never used a Microsoft product, right? And so that puts me in this weird place of I have poked around. It is clear to me there are extensions that you can download for Office 365 as well. I also know that GPT-0 has a playback feature that also does work on Office 365. But those tools exist. I have not played with them for 365 though.
Well, thanks, Chris, for that. And yeah, I know we're piloting what is it? Microsoft Copilot is going to be something, but it's still not totally released. It's, so I'm still waiting to find out more information about it. But I know Copilot has some neat functionality too.
I want to jump into Stacy's questions there too.
Yeah, go for it.
Is the next step developing new assignments that explicitly incorporate AI? I already have done that. We'll talk about that in a sec. And also assignments that aren't papers. I've already done that as well. And that has really went a long way. Actually, if you look at the one assignment that I had Brad upload on the Odyssey plan, right? That is a tripartite assignment, if I'm going to be very pretentious, because that's my thing, right? And the first one is a written short paper. The second one is a visual, like students are making a flowchart essentially. And then the third one is the one where they are reacting to AI, but they are reacting to it in a presentation format. So they are going to take AI's output and turn it into a PowerPoint that then they are critiquing. What did it get right? What did it get wrong? That has worked really well. Yeah, I have definitely found that I've definitely started leaning on presentations more generally, right? I think, look, AI avatars and stuff really create avenues where this could be spoofed too. But my experience is most students aren't doing that. And I also think presentations are something I have found it is very easy to make a value argument for. When I tell my students, hey, you could cheat on this and like maybe use AI to help you write the script. I don't really care as much about that. I do, but the thing I care a lot more about is the actual how you're presenting. And you do need to learn those skills, right? If you don't learn that skills, you're going to have a really hard time in any sort of career path you're going down. And I think most of my students generally have found that to be true. So it's very easy to get student buy-in there, I have found. But yeah, I also have incorporated more experiential learning and authentic assessments and things like that over the course of the semester as well. Don't get me wrong, my only thing has not been these 6 things, but also incorporating, trying to update my class along the way as well. reading through more questions
Yeah, I
here.
was wondering which one. Do you want to hit Brandon? Or Brandon, if you want to come off mute, you always can too. You're good at this stuff too. So if anybody wants to come off mute, or if you want to ask questions that are not recorded, just let me know. And we're at 2:40. I could kill the recording part, and you can ask any questions you want. It gives Chris time to read too.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brandon. What's up?
I'll stop it.